Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is E.G. Dizon, and I will be your moderator for this morning's webinar. On behalf of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies, we welcome everyone to today's webinar on perspectives on China-South Asian relations. And so before we begin our webinar, I would just like to set a few ground rules. So first, we will be using the Zoom chat feature to accommodate all of your questions. Please make sure to include as well your name and your affiliation whenever asking questions. Okay, so without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Mr. Don McLean Gill is a resident fellow at the International Development and Security Cooperation and the Director for South Asia and Southeast Asia in the Philippine Middle East Studies Association. He is a geopolitical analyst and author of over 60 publications on Indian foreign policy and South Asian geopolitics. He is currently completing his master's in international studies under the Department of Political Science at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. So friends, let us all welcome Mr. Don McLean Gill with a virtual round of applause. Don, you may take the floor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dizan. And it's a true pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation in behalf of in behalf of PAX. And again, it is truly an honor to share the room, especially with distinguished Professor Dr. SWARAN Singh. And it is truly wonderful to be able to share my views on such a relevant issue in terms of global politics. So allow me to share my slide and so we can start the presentation. Right. Okay. So the topic that we are going to delve on today in behalf of my presentation would revolve around China's engagement with South Asia. Now, China's engagement with South Asia is multidimensional. So there are social cultural factors, economic factors, and of course, there are strategic security and geopolitical factors as well. Now, I will be focusing on the geopolitical dimension of these engagements and, of course, its implications for India. Now, to get the ball rolling, uh, it's important to share the outline of my presentation for us to have a little bit of an idea about what the presentation would be about, just to set the parameters of the discussion. The first part would be outlining South Asia as a region, and of course, the significance of the Indian Ocean and the South Asian region as well. The second point would be discussing about China's entry into South Asia and the greater Indian Ocean region, which would be followed by the Sino-Indian power competition and trying to trace its particular roots and trying to map out the overall dynamics of Sino-Indian relations. The next part would be the BRI in South Asia, so the Belt and Road Initiative in South Asia. So I don't intend to delve into all the projects, just the major highlights, and I intend to just give an overview regarding the BRI in South Asia, the geopolitical dimensions of the BRI. And then we will talk about specifically the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is considered to be the flagship project of the BRI. And of course, we'd be discussing the challenges towards the CPEC and its implications for India, a way forward for India, given all these important developments. So let us begin. Now, we have to understand that South Asia, the term South Asia, was not widely used until the 1980s. Now, South Asia was first used by extra-regional actors after the Second World War. Now, these include American scholars, academics, government officials, and Europeans as well. Now, due to its exogenous conceptual origin, now this brought varied interpretations among the states of this particular region. Now, the only time, or perhaps I could say one of the defining factors that laid out the outline of the South Asian region was the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, which was established in 1985. But however, like all geographical spaces, there are contestations as to where we draw the line. So we would be discussing this further in the next few slides. Now, South Asia and the Indian Ocean, why are these two components, these two geographical spaces so relevant, especially today in terms of global geopolitics? Well, South Asia is strategically located at a juncture between the energy rich West and Central Asia, and then it forms a bridge connecting to East Asia, so both North and Southeast Asia. And this is highly relevant considering that the adjacent waters of South Asia, the Indian Ocean, are critical for trade, commerce, and of course, power projection. The Indian Ocean is home to important sea lines of communication and maritime choke points. So these include the Strait of Hormuz, which links the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf. And we have the Strait of Malacca, which is the entry and exit point between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And we have the Bab el Mandeb Strait, which links the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. So, why is this important? In terms of trade, in terms of volume, 80% of the world's seaborne oil trade passes through Indian Ocean choke points. So I have included these particular choke points into the discussion. So around 40% goes through the Strait of Hormuz, 35% to the Strait of Malacca, and 8% to the Bab el Mandeb Strait. Now, it is important to discuss China's entry into South Asia, but first we have to understand why it has entered into South Asia with such an increasing presence throughout the last few years. Now, this is absolutely important given the geopolitical dynamics of China-South Asian relations and, of course, China-India relations. Now, power competition in East Asia has been quite relevant, especially one of the critical components would be the Obama administration's pivot to Asia. So the rebalance strategy, which then intends to check China's rise, as we call it. So China has been significantly rising in terms of economic and military capabilities. And this has created a significant shift in the overall distribution of power in the international system. Now, given that the international system is founded on uncertainty, anarchy, and self-help, we see that it is inevitable for established great powers to get into the picture and check those that are rising great powers as well. However, what I want to point out here is that systemic factors are not the only determinants of state behavior, especially among great powers or potential great powers. In fact, it is also domestic in nature, that when we talk about state perception, we talk about power transition, for example, how the United Kingdom uh, passed the baton to the United States in such a peaceful manner. So this is what we call the balance between power and perception, which we would be discussing today. So I'd like to widen the horizon beyond just systemic variables in understanding the distribution and the interaction of states. Now, China's rise, as I've mentioned, has served as a challenge against the status quo Pacific power, which is the United States. This is quite inevitable considering the dynamics of international politics, given the check and balance system of the international system, given the potential role of great powers and, of course, the rise of potential great powers. So any shift in the balance would create certain uncertainties and would create certain implications, good or bad. Now, however, it is important to note that despite China's significant and noteworthy rise, it still lacks the naval power to necessarily protect all of its sea lanes of communication. Now, what does this mean? Now, one important factor which I'd like to highlight is what we call the Malacca Dilemma. Now, due to China's heavy reliance on the Strait of Malacca for energy imports, it fears that during a national security crisis or any form of conflict, especially with the United States for that matter, ships carrying out energy resources would be stalled in terms of completing their necessary routes towards China due to hostile naval forces. Now, the Malacca Strait is a very narrow and congested waterway. If we talk about the geographical dimensions of the Malacca Strait, separating Indonesia and Malaysia with Singapore, and it's located at the southern tip. Now, as I've mentioned, the Strait of Malacca is a significant entry exit point between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So this is clearly vital, considering that the energy rich countries are located uh, within the Indian Ocean region as well. So the transit is absolutely crucial for China as it continues to grow. Its energy requirements will significantly increase as the years go by. Now, let's talk about this. So we have the Malaccan Dilemma, we have geographical limitations, and of course, the United States and its Eastern allies trying to balance or trying to check the particular rise of China in the East. This has significantly provided a motivation for China to look beyond its traditional area or its traditional geographic neighborhood. Now, in talking in terms of China's importance in South Asia, and of course its pivot towards South Asia, it is important to discuss the maritime dynamics of this particular shift. Here I have three basic phases or general phases that I would like to discuss, which will give us further light into the reasons for China to go beyond its traditional periphery. Now, during the pre-1980s, we have what we call the near coast defense of China. So that includes up to 12 nautical miles that extend seaward from China's coastline. Now, it also includes land territory of about 300 kilometers that stretches inland from the coastline. Now, during the mid 1980s and the early 2000s, a dramatic shift has taken place, which we would like to call as the near seas active defense. So, from the near coast defense to the near seas active defense, China's span, its maritime span, its naval capacity has significantly improved in line and parallel with its capabilities towards the first island chain, which includes the Yellow Sea, East and South China Seas, and the adjacent areas to the outer rim of the North Pacific. Now, most importantly, now this is where the analysis comes in, is that during the mid 2000s, China has begun operating far seas. So this include the parameters between the Northwest Pacific to the Eastern Indian Ocean. Now, 2008 has been a phenomenal point for China, considering that that is when, after the financial crisis, it has recalibrated its foreign policy, its economic policies, in order to match these far seas operations. Though its capabilities are not complete yet in terms of providing support for all far seas operations, but compared to how it was before during the 1980s, a little bit into the post 1980s, these capabilities have significantly improved. Now, 2013 has actually been a significant year as well in terms of academic resources in China. There have been a series of noteworthy publications in China regarding its far seas capabilities, particularly into the Indian Ocean. Now, I'd like to draw the attention towards the Blue Book report, which was published in 2013 on China's developments in the Indian Ocean. So, the Blue Book report is not really an official policy, but a report by a renowned China based think tank. Now, these China based think tanks, including the CASS, they're very prominent. They have a significant sway in terms of policy prescriptions uh, that mirror Beijing's view in terms of strategic affairs, economic affairs, and its national security interests. The report, however, observed that in the past, China has played more of a marginal role in areas that include the Indian Ocean. However, the changing dynamics of international politics and international relations have motivated China to play a more proactive role in the affairs of the Indian Ocean region. The report, however, tries to dispel the notion of China posing as a direct threat to the region, and that uh, also implies that China is not a threat to India, which is considered as the status quo power in the Indian Ocean region. Now, this report also discusses India's position basically through its Look East policy, which sort of gives it some sort of requisite to particularly involve itself in the affairs of the Indian Ocean region as well. However, what is important to note is that India maintains or seeks to mainly maintain the status quo in East Asia, while we can see that China has sort of shaken up the balance of power in the Indian Ocean region. And we would discuss its implications in the next few slides. Now, I left a particular reading which you all may be interested in, the Chinese Academy of Military Sciences Science of Military Strategy of 2013. There are versions before this and there are versions after this, but the 2013 version is relatively significant vis-a-vis the Blue Book report, considering it discusses China's increasing involvement or its desire to increasingly involve itself in the Indian Ocean region. Now, as I mentioned, there is a section in the Blue Book report on the Look East policy of India. According to Indian maritime expert Mr. Abhijit Singh, acknowledging India's stake in the Pacific is a clever way indeed to justify China's own equities in the Indian Ocean. As I've mentioned, India does not seek to revise the status quo in East Asia, but merely wishes to complement it through stronger engagements with the countries in that region. China's strategic interests in the Indian Ocean revolve around, of course, its sea lines of communication, energy supplies, and most importantly, power projection capabilities as it seeks to fuel its great power ambitions in the international system. Now, let's talk about the Sino-Indian power competition. I'd like to start this off by saying that the picture between India and China have not always been very competitive. In fact, there were areas of convergences uh, between these two Asian powers. Now, I would like to present and map out a general overview of Sino-Indian relations, which include uh, power and perception, as I've mentioned, the systemic distribution of power, and the domestic perception of elites that basically channel and configure the overview and the overall dynamics of this particular relationship, this bilateral relationship. Now, why is the Indian Ocean significant to India? Now, the Indian Ocean is an especially important component of India's national interest and foreign policy. The first Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, in 1958 stated that whichever power controls the Indian Ocean has India's seaborne trade at its mercy, and in fact, as well as its independence. Now, this statement is quite strong and its reflection of the significance of the Indian Ocean in India's strategic calculus should be taken into consideration in terms of assessing India's responses towards extra-regional powers in the vicinity. Now, India has been wary for a long time vis-a-vis extra-regional powers that cross the Indian Ocean. However, recently there have been levels of increasing tolerance towards like-minded states that share common ideologies and interests. The French, for example, the United States, consistently work with India. Japan has also included itself into the Indian Ocean. Australia, there have been a series of cooperative arrangements to secure the stability and the overall peace of the Indian Ocean region. Now, India before has been quite, as I've mentioned, reluctant to accommodate extra-regional powers into this geographic maritime space. However, throughout time, as the distribution of power shifts and continues to shift, there has been a significant level of accommodation for like-minded countries. Now, with its rise, of course, so it's not only China that has been significantly rising in terms of economic and military capability. In fact, India has shown a significant trend, a significant pattern of relative power and power maximization throughout the international system. And this is indeed one of the reasons how we would expect two potential rising great powers who are also neighbors and nuclear powers to inevitably sort of have conflicts within their range or within their areas of power projection. So this is the systemic factor demonstrates the competition side of the India-China rivalry or the India-China competition bilateral relationship in relation to the significant shift of the distribution of power in the systemic level. However, what explains cooperation from now and then is has been relatively uncalled for in terms of the systemic level. In fact, we have to look into both systemic and domestic levels to be able to gauge the series of events that have been taking place between China and India, particularly in the Indian Ocean region and in South Asia. Now, particularly talking about India's rise, the global narratives of India being a rising power and a potential great power challenges China's strategic interests, particularly in the Indian Ocean. Now, China is aware that to achieve these strategic interests in the Indian Ocean, it would be necessary to check the influence of the South Asian giant. So this is again the balance of power mechanism in place to be able to achieve particular relative gains. It is important, of course, to check uh, the status quo power in that particular area. So this is mostly common between extra-regional and regional states in a particular maritime or geographic space. Now, China's engagement with South Asia, as I see it, can be summarized into three particular points. So it's trade and investment, soft power diplomacy, and of course, the development of strategic ports and projects in strategically located countries in the Indian Ocean and in South Asia in particular. Now, I have sort of mapped out a, uh, a general trend in India-China relations. Now, as you can see, we are now entering into what many call one of the lowest points in India-China relations, strategic relations. Now, this is definitely in contrast to what happened during the 1940s to the 1950s. Now, let me talk a little bit about this chart, this map, which I sort of outlined. Now, to break it down, during 1949 to the 1950s, India was one of the first, or if not the first, non-socialist bloc country to establish diplomatic relations with the PRC. So we have also during this time the establishment of the Panchil or the five principles of peaceful coexistence and of course, India's accommodation towards China during the 1955 Bandung Conference. And of course, it is important to note that India played a pivotal role for the PRC to secure its position in the Security Council as well. So there has been a relative amount of accommodation between both sides during this particular era. However, in the late 1950s, there has been a certain tension. There was a particular tension between India and China, particularly along the border. Now, there was a letter sent to Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru regarding the so-called line of actual control, which was suggested in 1959. Now, this was not acknowledged by India. It was rejected by India, considering that India believes that its territorial sovereignty cannot be compromised in this particular domain, especially along the border. Now, the 1962 border war, which resulted in China's acquisition of Aksai Chin, is a significant development in India-China strategic relations. And since then, there has been that level of uncertainty between each other's perceptions towards one another. Now, 1971, another pivotal moment in India-China relations has been the so-called, this is within the Cold War, so we have the US-Soviet split, and of course we have the Sino-Soviet split. Now, India figured itself with the Soviet Union during this time in 1971. In the 1970s, there was the signing of the Treaty of Peace and cooperation between India and the Soviet Union. And due to that Sino-Soviet split, the other bloc, as we can see, consisted of China, Pakistan, and the United States. Now, Henry Kissinger's visit to China was also a pivotal moment during the 1970s, which catalyzed closer relations between the US and China. And of course, Pakistan being an ally of the United States during that time and a strategic competitor of India, did not really hold well for the regional dynamics or the dynamics of the international system during the Cold War. So during 1962 to 1975, we can say that China and India had their version of their own Cold War. However, 1976 to 1997, relations started picking up again, especially with resuming the exchange of ambassadors and the external affairs ministers visit, external affairs minister Bajpai and Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China consolidated the fact that that we should take relations to a better level and to make up for as what they believe to be lost time in the strategic relationship between India and China. So there was this level of reconciliation between the two Asian powers. China, during these particular years, also began to recognize Kashmir to be a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan, which was different from its stand before the 1970s. So the 1993 and 1996 agreements were also signed between India and China, which talk about basically a peaceful coexistence along the border. So there were a set of norms and institutions that were provided in order to safeguard this particular border between India and China, the line of actual control. However, during these particular periods, there were instances of inconsistencies as well between the two sides. So the statehood of Arunachal Pradesh, India's state of Arunachal Pradesh, did not really bode well for China as it continues to claim 90,000 square kilometers of the area. And China's military movements in Ladakh and China's nuclear weapon developments also created strains in the overall relation during this time. But overall, it fared fairly well compared to the 1962-1975 period. Now, during the 1998-1999 period, Prime Minister Vajpayee, during the time of Prime Minister Vajpayee, the nuclear tests of India resulted in a particularly significant strain in India-China relations. And this has been an area of concern between both sides, as now both sides are nuclearly equipped and and at the same time sharing a border and being in relatively uncertain relations between the two Asian powers has significantly contributed to the complicated dynamics of Sino-Indian relations. And going to 2000 to 2011, there was again an upward trend in order to recalibrate this particular partnership. So we have President Narayan's visit to China. We have the 2001 establishment of the Russia-India-China cooperative arrangement. We have 2001, where China was extended the dialogue partner for the Indian Ocean Rim Association for Regional Cooperation, which is one of the premium institutions for the Indian Ocean. And of course, Premier Zhu Rongji visited India, and of course, the observer status was given to China in 2005 for SARC, which is a major stepping stone that India has shown towards China that says, hey, we're accommodating you into this regional architecture. So we are looking into areas of cooperation that we could have with you in this particular domain. So these are good signs. And of course, the BRICS in 2006 and a number of high-level meetings have significantly catalyzed a positive trend in Sino-Indian relations. Now, in 2012 to 2016, until now in 2021, there was we could notice a downward trend, a continuously downward trend in India-China strategic affairs. Now, this is a result of systemic factors such as the rebalance strategy to Asia, which China considers to be a containment strategy, and of course, India's warming up of relations with the United States, which was India was later accorded as a major defense partner of the United States, and this created sort of negative perceptions for Beijing. Now, fast forward to 2017 to 2021. The Doklam standoff in 2017, the Galwan Valley clash, which resulted in a major catastrophe between Indian and Chinese soldiers in June last year, and of course the unproductive border negotiations of disengagement. Though there was a disengagement in the Pangong Lake, the North and South Pangong Lake, there's still a series of significant obstacles in the broader scheme of disengagement, including the Depsang Plains, including the hot springs. We will be discussing about this later on. So what I'd like to point out here is that despite the limitations in strategic relations between India and China, we could see that the economic trends have been consistently increasing ever since. And when we talk about 2017 to 2020, which I mentioned to be one of the lowest points, or if not the lowest point in India-China relations, we could see that China has once again scaled itself to be India's top trading partner. So what this sort of conflicts theorists who believe that economic relevance or interdependence can significantly minimize the potential for competition or strategic competition between two rivals or two competitors. However, I believe that if you are all familiar with one of classical realism's renowned scholars, Hans Morgenthau, he said that the political sphere is independent from the economic sphere and the social cultural sphere and so on, and the legal sphere. So as we can see here that these two separate realms have basically set up different results in terms of analyzing India-China relations. So that was just to point out that despite the strategic competition, India and China still maintains robust economic trade and economic relations. Now, there have been significant areas of convergence between India and China in the Indian Ocean. So this includes the security against piracy and terrorism, the People's Liberation Army Navy and the Indian Navy have jointly operated against piracy in the Gulf of Aden and off Somalia since 2008. Now, 2008, as I've mentioned earlier, was a pivotal year in terms of China's maritime or naval involvement into the Indian Ocean. Now, before 2008, you would rarely see the Chinese Navy operating in full scale. But in 2008, across the Gulf of Aden, China has led a significant anti piracy mission in the Indian Ocean. So since then, there has been a significant increase in naval activity among the Chinese in the Indian Ocean. Now, China and India also have a common interest in developing long-term global regime for preserving fish stocks and a crucial aspect of their food security. And of course, both states are also members of the RECAP, which is one of the pioneering regional institutions for non-traditional security issues in the Indian Ocean. However, mistrust and uncertainty continues to plague the relationship between India and China, as both are set to rise and as both are significantly rising, and as the balance continues to be shifting in the international system. We could see that there is more tension between the relationship of the two Asian giants. Now, in May 2020, as I mentioned, that would lead to the June 2020 Galwan Valley clash, is that in May 2020, China launched several near simulation incursions across the line of actual control in Ladakh into territory controlled by India. Now, this goes against the 1993-1996 agreements, which calls for a limited amount of military presence along the border. Now, India-China relations have fallen, as I've mentioned, to its lowest point since the Galwan Valley clash. And China seems to be dissatisfied with the line of actual control, considering that both countries have varied interpretations of what the line is and where it reaches. And India has managed, however, during the recent standoff, to gain an upper hand by securing its position in the Kailash Range in August 2020, which gave it a strategic advantage. And this, as many observers have noted, led to the talks towards disengagement in the Pangong Lake. February 10, after nearly 9 months of grueling negotiations, there have been a series of disengagements along the line of actual control, particularly in the Pangong Lake. However, there are still areas that have not been agreed upon by China for disengagement as well. So, talking about the Pangong Lake, under this agreement, the disengagement agreement, the PLA will move east of Finger 8 on the Sirja Plain, and the Indian Army will move back to Tansing Tapa post in Finger 3. And the area in between those points would be basically a buffer zone and will be demilitarized with patrolling schedules decided through consultations between commanders at a later stage. Now, the disengagement agreement seems to be restricted only, as I mentioned, to the Pangong So area. So there are also other sectors that need to be talked about, though China has assured disengagement in these areas as well. Talks have been stalled for several meetings since this particular disengagement in the Pangong Lake. So, such as across the Karakoram Pass, the DBO sector, the situation has not significantly changed. Other major areas would be the patrolling points 10 to 13 beyond the Y junction of the Depsang Plains, where Chinese troops continue to block Indian Army patrols in that area. And of course, there are other areas as well, such as the hot springs, that continue to be a point of escalation between India and China in terms of the border territory that they have between them. So, another point to the dimension of uncertainty and mistrust is that China has continued to solidify security partnerships with South Asian states, including most particularly Bangladesh and Pakistan. China and Pakistan have elevated their cooperation to an all-weather strategic cooperative partnership. Over Kashmir, Pakistan and India have fought 3 wars and also catalyzed the proliferation of the training of terrorist and insurgent groups in the region, which stalls the level of development between the two South Asian states. And China's rapidly expanding mega investment projects in strategically placed South Asian states have motivated an increased presence of its navy to safeguard its assets, inevitably, and its vital sea lines of communication. So observers call it the string of pearls strategy, which we seem to be in 16 years in already. This is basically the concern that China may convert these commercial facilities for military use. Now, this is a major area of worry when it comes to New Delhi's strategic calculus for the Indian Ocean and for South Asia, that China's increasing strategic footprints may significantly alter the status quo and the regional architecture of the Indian Ocean and of South Asia, which would be to the detriment of India's national interest. Now, going deeper into the BRI, let me just provide you a quick overview of what it really is. Now, the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, has two distinct components that we have to look into: the Silk Road Economic Belt and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. Now, China's overseas maritime activities have been characterized by the acquisition of existing ports, the development of new ports, and the controlling of port operations in strategically located places. Being piloted by state-owned enterprises, these enterprises not only invest the money needed for such ventures to be complete, but also oversee the construction and operation of these ports. Chinese ports have ensured China with sort of a permanent presence in the Indian Ocean, which worries India in terms of strategic level and geopolitical implications, as it has also been bolstering its capacity, its deterrence capacity in the Indian Ocean region. Now, China's long-term plan. I have taken from the theory of geopositional balancing, which was attributed by Dr. Jeremy Garlick. Now, he stated that China's long-term plan is to become a key Indian Ocean player uh, in a way that entails less strategic risk in exchange for high financial expenditures. Now, whether or not these expenditures would receive economic gains for China, now that's the point of question that we would have to look into more. So, what is important here is that the geopolitical dynamics are well in place in terms of in terms of these arrangements. Now, smaller South Asian countries, however, seem to be willing to accommodate China as a major development partner, while providing reassurance for India's security concerns. The difference between presence and influence, I must add, must be taken into consideration in terms of indicators that have been mentioned. So presence does not always mean influence. As we can see, the usual narrative is that China has overtaken India, the influence of China has overtaken India's. So the mere fact that the increase of presence is there does not literally translate to a significant increase in influence. So I have mentioned two possible indicators that we could look into to gauge this particular level of influence. China is influential in the Indian Ocean region. However, to what extent though? Now, in terms of naval exercises, when an extra-regional power tends to conduct frequent naval exercises with regional states, then we can say that there is an increase in influence given that this all happens amid the presence of the status quo power, which is India. However, as we look into the data, it is only Pakistan that continues to have regular or frequent naval exercises with China in South Asia or the adjacent Indian Ocean region. And the second point that we have to look into And going back to that, however, Sri Lanka's India First security policy also denotes this particular indication, is that Sri Lanka would look into India's security concerns as a priority before engaging in anything, particularly with extra regional powers. Now, this was the assurance of Sri Lanka to India. However, in line with that, Sri Lanka says that it would continue to have a pragmatic approach in terms of its economic relations in the Indian Ocean and with its economic partners. And of course, the relevance of the local population. As we can see, reports have shown that there have been a series of pushbacks or conflicts between local populations in South Asia against these particular mega infrastructural projects. So we could see that in Bangladesh, for example, concerns in Sri Lanka, concerns in Pakistan as well. We could see that there is still that level of concern among the local population regarding the increasing presence and involvement of China in economic ventures in the region. Now, China's strategic infrastructure development in South Asia has been quite recognized in terms of the narratives of international relations. So we look at Bangladesh, for example. The development of the Chittagong port or the Mongla port, which is also a strategically located port, has been a significant cornerstone in China's BRI project. So I'll show you a map. I think I'm going beyond my time here, so I'll just try to keep it as concise as possible. Now, Sri Lanka's development as well, in terms of the Hambantota port, which was given a 99-year lease to China, is a strategic port that allows China to have a significant and direct access to vital sea lines of communication in the Indian Ocean. The port is strategically located 10 nautical miles away from major shipping routes. And the geography of the port is quite isolated, which makes it very conducive for maritime and naval operations. And in line with this, a Chinese company now operates Colombo's new container terminal and is now in the process of developing a port city in Colombo with Chinese investments. Now, post-port visits by Chinese warships, specifically submarines, have also added to the perception that China's intentions in Sri Lanka may not be purely economic, as it has continuously stated in its official positions. Now, talking about submarines, the submarine dynamic of China's naval activities in the Indian Ocean has been significantly increased since 2013 with the deployment of its Shan class submarine, followed by 2014, which was the deployment of the Song class submarine and its port call on Colombo, and the Yuan class submarine in Karachi in Pakistan. And since then, there have been a series of increased involvement of submarines in the Indian Ocean, Chinese submarine deployment in the Indian Ocean. So that's the map for Sri Lanka. As you can see, the vital east-west shipping routes are right in place in terms of the Hambantota port. Now, Myanmar, we consider Myanmar to be part of ASEAN, Southeast Asia. But this is what I was telling about in terms of understanding the parameters of regions. Now, Myanmar figures in well with the dynamics of South Asia and, of course, the broader Indian Ocean region. So a consortium of Chinese companies was awarded 2 contracts in 2015 to create a special economic zone and the building of a deep sea port on the Bay of Bengal in Chao Pyu, the special economic zone in Western Myanmar's Rakhine State. So the deep sea port initially included 10 berths. However, it was renegotiated to 2. And this is about 700 nautical miles from India's east coast and the strategic harbor of Vishakhapatnam. Now, China has also the 2 pipelines, major pipelines between it and Myanmar, which has oil and gas, which consists of oil and gas, or oil and gas pipelines. Now, these are strategic, and I would encourage you to read more on Jeremy Garlick as he sort of uncovers that these investments may not really give potential economic yields, but have strong geopolitical properties, which China may use in the long term. So that is in terms of Myanmar. And let us unpack the flagship project of the China Pakistan Economic Corridor. Now, the China Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, aims to connect Kashgar, a city in China's northwest region of Xinjiang, and to Pakistan's southern port of Gwadar in Balochistan by a network of railways, highways, airports, energy pipelines for trade and tourism purposes. It will be put that China's infrastructure companies are facing rigid domestic markets in China. So this provides an opportunity for Chinese infrastructure companies to make up for that strategic loss domestically. Now, the CPEC aims to catalyze development of new production chains at regional levels with China at the center. It will also serve as a crucial stepping stone to provide development in poor and politically unstable parts of Pakistan, particularly in Balochistan. So it reduces the distance for Chinese goods bound for the US, Europe, and Africa by a substantial 2,000 miles by providing an alternate to the Strait of Malacca. So we go back to the Malacca Dilemma. And this is particularly one of the alternatives to that particular dilemma. Now, this is a map of CPEC. As you can see, it passes through Gilgit-Baltistan, which I will go to later to mention India's concerns regarding such a particular BRI project, or what China calls its flagship project for the BRI. Now, um, just to browse through the general overpoints of CPEC, it is approximately $60 billion. It cements the all-weather strategic partnership of Pakistan and China. And of course, when President Xi Jinping came in 2015 for a state visit to Pakistan, it developed a crucial turning point for the development of CPEC. President Xi Jinping arrived in Pakistan, initiated to develop a series of plans regarding energy, infrastructural development, and the like. He also oversaw the signing of a series of agreements, which then amounted to $46 billion during that time. Now it's up to $60 billion. However, the question is how much has been particularly used. So now we can look up to 20 to 25 billion dollars in terms of um, the actual materialization on the ground. Now, is it solely economic? So this is the purpose of this discussion: is that are China's investments, its infrastructure developments, solely economic? Now, the CPEC may have important economic properties. However, its geopolitical dimensions are well emphasized. Going back to Jeremy Garlick's example of geopositional balancing, it states that China looks into looks into a long-term strategy in order to develop strategically located infrastructure for further or for future geopolitical use. Now, if we look into the economic dynamics of this, uh, Pakistan's limited financial resources and its poor infrastructure really means that the project will be very, very expensive for China. Pakistan was not really a priority market for China, and its economic and political situation has been unpredictable. And of course, the challenging security conditions between the military and the civilian government has also been a cause of concern in terms of the stability of such projects. So there is really no guarantee whether Pakistan will be able to pay these loans back on time. Now, let's talk about briefly the geopolitical dimensions of CPEC. So we have the Gwadar port. So it connects three particular regions: South Asia, West Asia, and Central Asia. It will also provide China with direct access into the IOR, or the Indian Ocean region, through the Arabian Sea. Pakistan will also be strategically placed with greater geopolitical relevance in the region. So additionally, the port is said to benefit other landlocked neighboring countries with natural resources having the opportunity to transport these resources beyond their traditional periphery, which means that they would be able to surpass geographical obstacles that were laid out beforehand. Now, going back to the Gwadar port, it is also very critical for Pakistan as it would allow it, the development of the port would allow it to monitor sea lines of communication originating from the Persian Gulf to the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this would provide Pakistan with a strategic leverage over India due to the latter's distance from Gwadar in comparison to two other strategic ports of Pakistan. And of course, uh, just to summarize this part, this would be a driver for China Pakistan naval cooperation. So China's crude oil demands have doubled from 1995 to 2006, and are expected to double again for the next 15 years. Now, the CPEC aims to lessen this particular dependence on the Strait of Malacca, and at the same time increase its strategic footprints in the Indian Ocean. So the roles of the Chinese Navy and the Pakistani Navy expanding into the Gwadar port has become an important pillar of the CPEC project. So in order to protect these developments, China would have to increase inevitably its naval collaborations with Pakistan, particularly in the Arabian Sea.
Hello, Don.
Now,
Excuse me.
uh,
Hello.
yes,
Yeah.
Mr. Gil.
I think we have to cut the the presentation since we are going over time already. Okay,
Okay, okay, yeah, yeah, I totally
so
understand.
yeah, so
Yeah.
maybe we could return to these once we enter into the open forum, if ever there
Oh,
are
yes,
slides.
absolutely. Absolutely. I
Okay.
think I went a little bit over time there.
Okay. So thank you. Um,
Yeah, thank you.
so with that, let me just there. So if you could end
Yeah,
the screen
stop
sharing,
sharing. Yeah.
and then we will continue. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you again. Okay, so
All right.
thank you again, Don, for that uh, fairly long but also very very insightful presentation. Okay, so now I guess we would like to move to our next speaker, Dr. Swaran Singh. Yeah, he is a chair and a professor in the and a professor in in the Center for International Politics, Organization, and Disarmament at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and he's also the president of the Association of Asian Scholars and also the General Secretary of Indian Association of Asian and Pacific Studies. And he has also been a visiting professor um, in the China West Normal University and at the Research Institute of Indian Ocean Economies, and also an adjunct senior fellow of the Charhar Institute, Beijing, and the Institute of National Security Studies in Sri Lanka, and Sichuan University, Dinjiang College. So, friends, without further ado, I would like to invite um, Professor Swaran Singh to take the floor. Dr. Singh?
Thank you, Dizon. I hope you can hear me clear.
Yes, 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 Dr. Singh. You may proceed.
Thank you so much. I also wish to thank and compliment the Philippines Association for Chinese Studies to give this entire session to focus on China-South Asia relations. And we just heard an exhaustive and a beautiful presentation by Don McLean Gill. What I will follow from his exhaustive presentation is to share Indian perspectives. So I must mention that in case you happen to next time invite scholar from another South Asian country, it's likely that their perspectives will slightly vary from what I'm going to present to you. So that's a first confession I must make, that my narrative or my analysis of China-South Asia relations, perhaps willingly, unwillingly, will be India-centric, presenting Indian perspectives. And of course, I also dare say that I am often much conscious of making such monologues when I see a lot of eminent people among audience. A very large number of participants are attending this, which is very encouraging for us to see this interest in China, South Asia. Let me also recognize among the audience my very dear friends. Professor Tina Clemente is here, Professor Darlene Estrada is here. So many of senior people are amongst us, as also younger people. I see some students from India also joining today's discussion. So thank you very much for giving your time to us. And I also must begin with a little bit of self-selling. Several years ago, a few years ago actually, I wrote this book called China, South Asia, Issues, Equations and Policies. So especially younger scholars who may have a deeper interest in China, South Asia, could try and access that. But as I said, I always look forward to the second part of open discussion where we will know either the comments of participants or the questions showcasing the specific interest areas that they have, where they wish to engage the speakers. And I'll be very happy to then try and respond to their questions or comments. But let me make an opening statement, opening exposition on China-South Asia relations. Depending that I notice most of the participants are from Philippines today, for obvious reasons, because Philippines Association for Chinese Studies is hosting it. I wanted to first put the map on the screen so that when we look at from South Asian perspective, the map itself looks slightly different. Depending on where we live on the planet, we all are used to looking at the map from where we live, and we have analyzed the global map from various perspectives, but from the focus area where we are located. So from South Asian perspective, I think the map would look like this. Second important thing to understand is China and South Asia civilizationally were very differently focused. China was largely focused on East Asia, creating a scenic world, as we say, Sinicization of countries like Korea, Japan, and several North and Southeast Asian countries happened. And India was much more focused on Southern Asia, as we call it. In that sense, for a long time, as Don McLean Gill was saying, India was not even, this region was not even called South Asia, it was called Indian subcontinent. And a very interesting book came last year by India's current serving foreign minister. It's called The India Way. And among other several things, it makes a very interesting proposition saying, in case the British colony had continued to stay as one, and you would remember that the British Indian colony was inclusive of what today is called Bangladesh and Pakistan. And indeed, till 1937, even Myanmar was part of the same colony. So the first point he makes is that in case this British colony had continued to be as one entity, one country, this would have had nearly 2 billion people living in that country. So in that case, China would have been a far smaller country compared to this Indian subcontinent in case it was one country. But because it was repeatedly partitioned, now India is still almost equal to China. South Asia indeed is bigger than China. So that's a reality which we need to keep in mind of how history has evolved. So despite their focus being, as I mentioned, in separate geographical theaters of, scenic world and the Indic world, and their circles of life as if being very, very different, there was intermittent but persistent, very limited interactions that happened historically between the scenic world and the Indic world. And that's why, in fact, the region called Indochina which is Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, was seen where India and China kind of came face to face. So Indo-China is where kind of they met in Indian and Indic influence moving from Southern Asia to Southeast Asia, Chinese influence to Northeast Asia, etc., etc. But largely circles of life being different. But as I mentioned, with persistent, intermittent connections in engaging, interacting, exchanging what was seen as extremely precious to life. So precious commodities is the trade that happened until we arrived in the modern age of fleets, where large ships could carry huge volumes on oceans. Till then, the trade was mostly in precious commodities, and the most precious commodity among them was, of course, our religious faith. So the whole spread of Buddhism, for example, from India to Southeast Asia and to China, and to, of course, all of East Asia, Northeast Asia, is something that was the way people understood each other, became conscious of each other. So China consciousness in Indian subcontinent and Indian consciousness in Chinese way of life was there, but of course it was precious but minimal. And therefore what we are saying here is that in that sense, persistence of consciousness was there, but only among elites, and it was not a commonplace knowledge in that sense. Until we reach the modern times, when the connectivity makes Southern Asia connected to the much larger area. And today we are even hearing, as Don McLean Gill mentioned, of the Indo-Pacific region. So Southern Asia is now certainly expanding and connecting, and the larger circle of life is making China inclusive of that understanding. And same is true of China. China's circle also is expanding to Asia Pacific, to India, Indo-Pacific, and the whole world indeed. So now compared to the older times when their circles of life were largely separated, today their circles of life overlap enormously. So what I'm underlining here is that there could be misunderstandings, mistrust, there could also be friendships, but the truth is that neither South Asia nor China can overlook each other. Whatever happens on either side influences the other side enormously. So therefore, there is a constant consciousness. But it's not been easy to connect with each other, because if you look at frontiers or disputed borders that we have in China and South Asia case, they are mostly difficult terrain of Himalayas. Himalayas are not only the highest mountains on the planet, they are still evolving geologically. And in that sense, the disputed borders have additional issues of geology, geography, history, colonial legacies, and so on. So the connectivity has not been really easy to build on everyday basis. Though, of course, as Mr. Gill mentioned, the trade has become an integral part because of oceans have facilitated huge volumes of trade to be exchanged from one side to the other. But the physical interface, of course, remains difficult. And Mr. Gill also brought out the whole tension of disputed borders between China and India. So fundamentally, what is the connect that we're talking of between China and South Asia? First of all, I think the fact that both represent ancient and continuing civilizations makes their historical and civilizational connect really overcast. We could try to run away and feel we are too modern to be worried about influence of historical ties. But in a DNA, in the civilizational DNA of both China and India, there are things that really become unusually significant. Now, for instance, compared to China-United States relations, which are much in discussion these days, South Asia's engagement with China moves across so many symbolisms, because civilizational connections make symbolisms very, very significant. And those symbolisms very often make both the understanding and conduct of mutual relations rather complex, both to understand for scholars and to practice among our policymakers and leaders. And what makes this complex relationship far more nuanced is this connections of Buddhism. Apologies for wrong spellings of connections here. Buddhism, in fact, has emerged as another very, very significant link between societies of South Asia and, of course, Southeast Asia as well. But South Asia and China is the discussion today. And we have noticed that from 2006 onwards, from Churchian times of President Xi Jinping, China has continued with this World Buddhist Forum, which Xi Jinping, as General Secretary of Zhejiang Province, had sort of initiated, and it has continued. So China today is described as world's largest state of Buddhist people. The believers of Buddhism are about roughly 300 million to about 400 million people in China, which is the largest population. And the fact that Buddha was born in Nepal, which is South Asia, Buddhism was born in India, and it is flourishing now across Asia Pacific, is an enormous connect. We could talk about current and contemporary issues, but those psychology of how we look at life, the symbolisms that we use to engage with each other, and the prioritization of issues, this way or culture of life really connects China and South Asian countries. More recently, of course, is their shared liberation struggles. Just like European nations had colonized parts of Indian subcontinent, they had also colonized various parts of China, and their liberation struggles were contemporaneous. Indeed, there's a whole lot of literature available to showcase how several Indian liberation leaders, especially the radical movement leaders, because China had that kind of liberation struggle which was much more radical and violent. So similarly, some of the radical leaders of India's liberation movement was given support and sanctuaries in China. And of course, also during the same liberation struggle, there was a negative and flip side as well. You would remember the two opium wars, where many Indian soldiers were used to punish China. The British were conducting that very, very destructive opium war twice, and that created a negative understanding of South Asia, South Asian people, and many of those soldiers stayed back in China, found new jobs in China. So both the negative and positive happened during the colonial period and the liberation struggle of the colonial period, which created both the positive spin-offs and also negative spin-offs between how Chinese understood South Asia and how South Asians engaged and understood China. Out of this whole interface was this issue of diaspora. Chinese diaspora is world famous. Southeast Asia, where the host of today's discussion is located in Manila, has a great understanding of the power and influence of Chinese diaspora. In South Asia, the Chinese diaspora was, of course, limited to Maldives, and there was, of course, a good number of Chinese from late 18th century onwards coming to India. But most of them left India. There are very few of them who still live, and in the east of India, there's a famous city of Kolkata, where you still have Chinese diaspora. There's a Chinese newspaper that still runs there. But during that 1962 India-China war, several of the Chinese people who lived in Indian subcontinent and India decided to sort of leave to other destinations. So that diaspora connect that you in South Asia would understand much more critical connect with China, both positive and negative, has not been as positive and as negative in terms of their strength. It's been relatively less influential when it comes to South Asia's connect with China. Instead, the colonial legacies and the Cold War legacies have been the stronger connect of South Asia with China. Colonial legacies because of borders, which created enormous misunderstandings with each other, and Cold War legacies as to how South Asia was divided. Pakistan, for example, decided to join the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization of 1950s and later became a close ally of China, continues to be the strongest friend of China in terms of strategic and defense cooperation, nuclear cooperation. So Cold War dynamics pushed India towards Soviet Union, and Sino-Soviet split meant that India was on the Soviet sort of a circle of friends, and China later moved to United States, building a strong alliance with the United States. So Cold War dynamics also saw South Asian countries moving in different networks of friendships, and India and China, of course, saw themselves in different circles of friends in that sense. So colonial and Cold War dynamics perhaps became much more influential uh, factors in how we understood each other. So if you geographically saw these two, Indian subcontinent and Chinese scenic world, there were enormously border issues to begin with. For example, India's border with Myanmar, which I mentioned was part of British colony till 1937, is about 1700 kilometers, but largely decided, clear, demarcated, but still porous. So there are always people who can move across, and particularly people who are insurgents, for example, from India's northeast, have had occasions of finding sanctuaries in Myanmar, in Upper Burma particularly, and sort of borders remain therefore a kind of a concern. And of course, Bangladesh, which is mostly part of Indian subcontinent, shares much of its borders, physical borders and maritime borders with India, is also demarcated. So there were some confusions, but that also got off in 2016, the final demarcation of those certain areas which on the border were still in certain confusion were resolved. But that's Myanmar, and now it's Bangladesh. And then you have another country here called Bhutan. Bhutan also has had territorial border disputes with China. So colonial Cold War legacies made border disputes appear as if they were the most important issue between China and India. And then you have Nepal. Nepal also has issues. You possibly have heard that even on the tallest peak of the planet, which is Mount Everest, both Nepal and China have contesting claims. And of course, some other areas of border disputes still continue. And then we had a Durand Line, which is a border between Afghanistan, which is now part of Southeast Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, is also something which is the colonial legacy, because it just cuts in the middle of the Pashtun homeland. So Pashtuns, which are the dominant community that mostly rules Afghanistan, are divided in the middle by Durand Line. So both in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, there is this continuum of Pashtun population. And that's why we notice the sanctuaries that Pakistan often provides to Taliban and other radical movements of Afghanistan. So again, colonial legacies are an issue. Border between India and Pakistan is again very artificial border, but the line that you just noticed is mostly demarcated. The undemarcated line is here that I just show you in orange color, if color is going fine with you. That is an area of what world very often reads about is province of Jammu and Kashmir. And within the province of Jammu and Kashmir, the border also connects China. And that border that connects province of Jammu and Kashmir to China remains completely undemarcated and disputed. And Mr. Gill also mentioned about the tensions that happened last year on this part of the border, particularly in Ladakh area, specifically in Galwan Valley, where we had even certain casualties last year. So this is Aksai Chin area, which is where Pakistan and India continue to be in dispute. And here is Aksai Chin, and this is Siachen border. And therefore, I'm saying colonial and Cold War legacies have kind of pushed other issues to the margins, because we are constantly focusing on these issues connecting China to South Asia. There's also a little bit of dispute in the middle sector of China-India border. There is another country here called Sikkim, which was seen as an independent country till 1957, and it merged into India in 1975. Then, of course, in the eastern sector, there is something called McMahon Line, which was again a colonial legacy of demarcation, which was a line drawn between Tibet and India, but the Chinese had not accepted it. So fundamentally, the countries that you see in South Asia mostly have been preoccupied with the territorial boundary disputes. And most of these disputes see linkages to colonial legacies, Cold War legacies, but also connected to China. And therefore, this has kind of preoccupied the power elites, the ruling elites in South Asia and China, as to how do they see each other, on what issues they engage and talk to each other. Of course, there are other important countries of South Asia like Maldives or Sri Lanka, which may not share territorial boundaries in this case, but they have maritime issues as well. So let me quickly move to how we have come in recent years. And we noticed that from 1990s, with the collapse of Soviet Union, simultaneous economic rise of China, we enter a whole new era of, sort of shifting from what was seen as geostrategic focus of global politics to geo-economic focus of world politics. And China emerges as a major economic player. And I often say, if Germany, Western Germany, was to emerge as the greatest and most powerful economy of Europe in 1990s or early 2000s, it would have been seen in a very different fashion, because rise of economic Germany happened in 1970s, where economics was seen not as the most important component of national power. We were living still in times of new Cold War, nuclear Armageddon, existential crisis. So economic rise of Germany was not seen the way economic rise of China was seen. Particularly, the collapse of Soviet Union made China look like the emerging new pillar. And the focus on geoeconomics shifted relationships of China to South Asia. So unlike its entire focus on engaging in defense cooperation with Pakistan, China saw India as a major country to engage in economic relationship. So earlier, China was building relationships with India's neighbors. Several scholars describe it as China's attempt to encircle or tie down India to South Asia by engaging India's neighbors, to now China directly engaging India in terms of economic relationship. And the 1988 visit of young Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi is seen as a watershed, where we agreed to say, let bygone be the bygone, and we can build cooperation in areas where we can. And then, of course, create atmospherics to develop relationship in other sectors. So the focus now shifted on what is called creating confidence building measures and expanding economic ties, which clearly changed the weightage of India in how China saw South Asia. So China's engagement with South Asia now changed, and we for the first time saw in the first half of 1990s a clear distinction of Chinese leaders making visits to South Asian countries separately to India. So there will be India alone visits, and then other visits to other South Asian countries to showcase how they looked at India relationship very differently compared to other relationships. Then in 1999, of course, 1998, sorry, this is a mistake. There were nuclear tests by India and Pakistan, which briefly disrupted the relationship. But this whole new chapter of confidence building measures and economic relationship was strong enough to overcome that anger or angst that China had about nuclear weapons in South Asia, and the relationship stayed more or less in control in that sense. So what is significant here is to see how shift from purely defense relationship Of course, it was partly triggered by the fact that Tibet, the soft underbelly of China, was a problem for China. And by the time of first 4 decades, China had more or less controlled Tibet sufficiently to open it up to the rest of the world, and therefore it was easier for China to now engage South Asia in a very different fashion. Otherwise, it was engaging Pakistan primarily because Pakistan could help China in ensuring stability in Muslim-dominated Xinjiang, also giving it a certain advantage in borders with Tibet. But now, Tibetan control focus on economic relationship was to redefine China's relationship with South Asia. And these two pie charts are perhaps the easiest way to understand how relationship between China and South Asia completely transformed from the early decade of 1990s. You will notice that in 1994, Pakistan was virtually half of the economic pie that China had with South Asia. And I dare say, if you go back and look at the relationship of early 1980s, when China-India trade was almost not there, Pakistan was virtually the most important relation as far as China's view of South Asia was concerned. But now, within a decade, you see that India virtually, occupies more than 2/3 of the economic relationship of China with South Asia. So that's a good reflection of how China's view of its engagement with South Asia completely transformed itself, simply because focus shifted from defense and strategic relationships to building economic and development partnerships. And I will soon share with you how, despite enormous tensions in last 2 years, that larger economic and developmental partnership still remains important. So here we saw trade and investments emerging as important link of China with South Asia. In terms of geopolitics, it immediately meant that China was allowed now to enter as observer in South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation from 2005. So it became an important player in what was largely seen as a South Asian regional forum. Indeed, in 2005, SAARC also opened up for 9 total observers, including European Union. And likewise, in 2008, India and Pakistan joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to begin with, was a Chinese brainchild of engaging Russia and Central Asian republics. But as SCO also opened up to other observers. So there was an impact on geopolitics of geoeconomics, redefining the trends of relationship. So here what we see is that now, not only shifting from defense strategic relationship to geoeconomic relationship and its impact on geopolitics, but also how these forums now expanded to bring in several other international players. So China's South Asia interface now not only shifted to geoeconomics, but also became regional and global. So repeatedly, China was engaging, meeting, interacting with Indian leaders and other South Asian leaders in various regional ASEAN-centric, for example, from 1990s, several ASEAN-centric forums also brought in South Asian countries. The last one, for example, is East Asia summits. Now, increasingly, these regional and global level interactions of China with South Asia started influencing mutual understanding and equations, shifting away from historical and bilateral focus, which had continued to dominate in the first half a century of mutual relationship. And therefore, now China's Belt and Road Initiative and India's concern with China-Pakistan economic corridor become significant. Mr. Gill did detail on these issues to a certain extent. Let me also repeat what I think he mentioned about from 2005 also gradually India-US rapprochement, India-US coming closer, emerging close strategic partners, has also impacted China's view of South Asia, particularly China's view of India's relationship. But still, if you notice the underlying factors of economic and development networking, the corridors of Belt and Road initiatives, at least 3 of them connect China to South Asia, or indeed 4 actually. even Indo-China corridor, Indo-China corridor, China-Bangladesh-India corridor, China-Pakistan-India corridor, and more recently, China-Nepal-India corridors, and of course, Maritime Silk Road. So almost 5 to 6 corridors of China when it creates imaginations of various corridors under Belt and Road Initiative linked to South Asia. That is simply because about 20% of the world lives in South Asia. Till we moved into pandemic, this was also the region of rapid development. So China would love to engage this region very, very clearly. So in ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, again, South Asia, despite all the hiccups, is really the most significant uh, part of China's imaginations. And you can notice individually here, this is China, Bangladesh, Myanmar, India corridor. And this is, of course, also the China, Nepal, India corridor, which is sometimes also called China, Nepal, India cultural corridor. But of course, as Mr. Gill mentioned, the most important corridor under debate remains the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which has its own hiccups. I'm told despite the promised investments reaching about $65 billion now, the investments on the ground are less than about $8 billion so far, which have been consummated. And that's partly because of multiple administrative hiccups. I'm not saying there are political equation problems here. Now, India's difficulty with the China-Pakistan economic corridor, very quickly, is the fact that it passes through the province of Jammu and Kashmir and the territories claimed by India. Historically, China had described this as disputed territories. But when it conceptualized China-Pakistan economic corridor, this called it Pakistan because the corridor is called China-Pakistan corridor. It's not called China-Pakistan disputed territories corridor. No, it's called China-Pakistan economic corridor. So how did China shift that policy of last 70 years of calling this as a disputed territory to now call this Pakistan? Is something India doesn't understand. I don't think any Chinese scholars understand or have been explained as to why that policy changed. So in that sense, this region called Kashmir or the province of Jammu and Kashmir remains a significant issue where India feels it's a breach on Indian sovereignty and therefore India has not participated in China-Pakistan economic corridor despite the fact that Chinese have repeatedly made overtures. Because China-Pakistan economic corridor becomes commercially viable only if it connects to India as well. And Chinese have been trying, but India has refused. But let me also underline that China has not denounced the entire Belt and Road Initiative. India continues to engage China in, for instance, eastern side where we talk about China, Myanmar, Bangladesh, India corridor. India is second largest stakeholder in Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which finances much of these corridor projects and many other areas. So there are areas of dispute and areas of convergence. I think if you want to look at future, we talk in India and in South Asia actually, we today talk in South Asia of the greatest asset of South Asia being what we call democratic and demographic dividend. It's unusual that entire South Asia has democracies today and thriving democracies more or less. And demographic dividend is visible compared to United States median age, for example, being 38 years, India's age being at least a decade younger, 28 years, and Pakistan's youngest in South Asia, 22 years. So when you look at these bubbles, if my slide is appearing on your screens much more clearly, you will notice that China's bubble is moving out of the global bubble. So the median age in China is longevity terms higher. Median age is younger, but longevity is higher here. The global longevity is where South Asia is located. If you see South Asian bubble, you will see it is located in the middle of the world bubble, and also India's bubble is located in the middle of that bubble. So democratic and demographic dividend of South Asia, I think, are becoming far more significant. And if you notice how the centennial goals, the two centennial goals that President Xi Jinping has outlined, Gradually evolving China into beautiful democratic country remains a significant objective for China today. So in future, I assume it is the democratic and demographic linkages of intersocietal relationships. We are going to redefine how China and South Asia engage with each other. And that is why the infusion of technology, the linkages are very different today than how linkages were today. We are much more connected in virtual world than in actual physical world. And therefore geographies, I sometimes joke with my colleagues from geography department, geography is becoming history. Geography unusually dominated our view of life over centuries. Now the connections are in cyberspace, in outer space, in virtual space. They are also becoming influential. And that is how we have viewed the pandemic politics, for example, in recent years. Uh, China and India are undertaking the parallel vaccine diplomacy, medicine diplomacy. Both of them produce large amounts of vaccines, medicines, healthcare workforce. But most interesting part you should notice is how China and India have been going around the world, helping several other nations in the neighborhood and beyond without undercutting each other. So, despite all the tensions that happened in 2020, pandemic politics did not see China and India undercutting each other or competing in zero sum kind of game with each other, but providing parallel help to countries. And that brings up very interesting connection in the pharmaceutical. India today is called the pharmacy of the world, but depending on which particular medicine you are looking at, 70 to 90% of the raw materials, as we call APIs, for Indian medicine manufacturing comes from China. A very large number of doctors of Indian citizens, Indian origin, are being trained in China for last decade almost. At the peak, there were about 17,000 Indian students learning medicine in China. So the integral
Dr.
connect in
Singh,
pharmaceutical, yeah,
Dr. Singh,
just one
sorry.
minute,
Yeah, we have
one
just
minute.
around five minutes left. Okay.
I'll take not more than 2 minutes in that case.
Okay. Thank you.
So, pharmaceutical, thank you so much. Pharmaceutical connect of China and India, the healthcare connect of China and India has become really significant. And India's former national security advisor had a long interview recently in one of the newspapers in India, where he mentioned how, for the first quarter of this year, compared to the last year, the same quarter for 2020, first quarter of 2020, China India trade has increased 47%. So economic relationship is not dented as you might imagine because of tensions between China and India. And therefore, despite this diminished economies in South Asia, the economic linkages of South Asia with China have not diminished. That could partly be because Chinese economy has not so much diminished. China is the only rare country among large economies to showcase 2.3% growth for even 2020, and its economic leverages are becoming far more significant. But pandemic has also dented China's political prestige. China was gradually using BRI to convert its economic leverages into political goodwill. And political costs that pandemic has caused China is a great challenge. And I think that will also force or compel China to engage its immediate neighborhood, both in Southeast Asia and South Asia, far more vigorously, using its economic leverages, healthcare leverages. And therefore, we will see China becoming far more impelled or compelled to engage South Asia using this new platform of healthcare sector, which is emerging as the most significant theater of interface around the world. And I think that is where I wish to stop. And I think I must say thank you very much. I obviously also, following the initial speaker, perhaps went beyond my time, but I look forward now to the comments and questions, which is where I will be much more comfortable in knowing what is your specific interest, and will try to respond to your comment and questions. Thank you, and back to Mr. Dizon.
Thank you, Professor Singh. Okay. So, um, if we could end the screen sharing so that we could yes, there. Okay. So There. Okay. So now we, of course, open the floor to our open forum, wherein we would allow our participants to ask questions. No? In the interest of time, unfortunately, I don't think that we will be able to accommodate all of the questions, but we will try to answer as many of them as possible. Okay, so one of our initial questions here um, has is with regard to what are the areas of cooperation for India and China to make the 21st century an Asian century. Okay. Any of our speakers could answer.
Maybe Mr. Gill can also switch on his video. And indeed, if participants can also switch on their videos, we would love to see each other and talk to each other.
Okay. So would any of our speakers like to answer that particular question?
Let me take then that question. I thought Mr. Gill was going to speak. But as I said, let me encourage all the participants, in case they can, please switch on your video so that we can feel we are in the same room and we can talk to each other more directly, as if we are in the same room in that sense. Areas of cooperation, as I closed my discussion by saying, to me, appear the healthcare sector is going to occupy global attention in coming decades. Because if you look back in last 2 decades, starting with the SARS, Ebola, H1N1, bird flu, and now of course COVID-19, one after another, the diseases spread have become transnational, and now today we are in the middle of pandemic, which is global. And that is not going to disappear because of enormous connectivity that the world has developed over a period of time. So healthcare would become the most important theater of what will be seen as significant focus for the entire world. And India and China together, account for about 36% of humanity. And if you put together China and South Asia, it goes up to 40% of the world. So if we are talking of healthcare becoming the significant focus of the coming times, where do the humanity live? They live in South Asia and China. So China and South Asia will have to really not just enhance their cooperation in health sector, but also develop certain synergies to go and help others. Because of largest number of health force that we produce here in South Asia and China, medicines that we produce here in South Asia and China. Other than that, of course, very quickly, I think lately Indo-Pacific has been another major area, theater of discussions. And China remains a major player in the Pacific region. And China so far remains as an outlier because it is US-led debate. And it remains incomplete unless China and Russia are brought into that debate also. And India has been advocating that kind of policy stance. But I want to restrict this discussion much more to the fact that healthcare to me will be perhaps the most significant area of seeing expanded focus and cooperation between China and South
Okay.
Asia.
Don, do you have any comments on this question?
Well, Dr. Singh has wonderfully highlighted the relevant area for which India and China can cooperate despite strategic uncertainties in their bilateral relationship, and that is to look into their roles as responsible stakeholders in the international system at a time when countries are being crippled by the disastrous effects of the pandemic. So I completely agree with Dr. Singh that this is a vital area for long-term cooperation as part of low politics as well.
Okay. So thank you. We have a hand raised here from Hari P. Dungana from Nepal. You may unmute yourself if you wish to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question is, I think, goes to Professor SWARAN, SINGH, JNU. First of all, I would like to inform Mr. SWARAN Singh, we don't have any border dispute with China, but we have some border issue with India. For your kind information. My question, is it true Nepal is converting as a strategic country between China and India and also in South Asia in terms of global political polarization after COVID-19? Should China increase the engagement in different areas with the strategic development project in Nepal in this developing global scenario? Or should Nepal join as a part of Indo-Pacific strategy?
Thank you, Mr. Dungana. I appreciate your question to me. But I would only like to underline the facts. And facts that have been endorsed by Nepalese officials and Nepalese media, that there is a misunderstanding on Mount Everest between China and Nepal. Recently, there was an entire village being constructed by China, and you can just Google right now and look at even the Nepalese media talking about it, of the boundary dispute that exists between China and Nepal. Between India and Nepal, there is hardly any border. The border is porous border. Indeed, the Nepalese citizens can come to India and Indian citizens can go to Nepal and do business, buy properties, live like normal citizens without much of documentation. We don't need any visas with each other. So in that sense, it's a porous border. In fact, Nepalese have all the rights in India that I have in India, other than electing political leaders. So India-Nepal is a very different border compared to China-Nepal border. That's my first response. On issue of pandemic, Nepal has done wonderfully. They've done a lot more inoculation of vaccines to their citizens than many other countries have done. For example, Afghanistan has the poorest record in this case of 0.6% only. Nepal, I think, has reached about 7% of the population inoculated. So in that sense, yes, Nepal has played a good role. His third issue was Indo-Pacific, and indeed, among others, the United States, the Trump administration was perhaps most keen to bring Nepal into the Indo-Pacific. And in fact, I should not be doing self-selling, but in a recently published book from Nepal, and you would perhaps know that Nishchal Pandey, I'm sure you know him in Kathmandu, has published a book last year in which I had a chapter on how India and Nepal can work together in the Indo-Pacific region. So if you know Nishchal, and I think this book should be online available, you can look at what is my view on the subject. But Nepal for South Asia remains most significant, and that's my last point in responding to you. Many of my friends, when we discuss Nepal, we talk that Kathmandu is not only Nepalese capital, it is capital of South Asia. And that is because SAARC Secretariat is based in Kathmandu. And whenever we talk about South Asian regional cooperation using the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, Kathmandu holds unusual advantage of being the country that hosts the SAARC Secretariat. So recently, the pandemic, which made the SAARC leaders come together again and discuss SAARC issues and how to deal with pandemic at the South Asian level. The Secretariat played an important role, and SAARC initiated an emergency fund immediately. So Nepal has a significant role for me when it looks like how South Asia has tried to build its regional cooperation. And in that, Nepal remains very, very significant. There are some irritations between Nepal and India in recent times, but I don't see them at all overwhelming the long-term relationship that we have. And India and Nepal share a very unique relationship, and the strength of that is unusual. No other relationship, either for India or for Nepal, can ever match that thick relationship that India and Nepal share.
Okay, so thank you to that response. We have another question here. Does India play a leadership role in determining the relationship of China with South Asia? Any of our speakers can, yeah.
Mr. Gill should also respond to some questions.
Can you repeat the question, Mr.
Oh,
Dizon?
sorry. Does India play a leadership role in determining the relationship of China with South Asia?
Should I go first or?
Okay, sure.
Okay, just to give a brief statement on that is that we must acknowledge that whenever there is a balance and that balance is shifted, there tends to be certain implications that may redirect the overall interaction of states in that particular system. In this case, the South Asian region, where India traditionally has considered itself to be the status quo power, the net security provider, even of the overall Indian Ocean region. However, as these shifts occur, including China's rise, for example, which inevitably led it to increase its presence in the Indian Ocean, there would be a certain degree of wariness from India, as I have mentioned earlier, regarding extra-regional powers. So the need rather to have proper signaling, the open communication, is absolutely crucial in order to communicate, in order to avoid strategic miscalculations on that matter.
Okay, Dr. Singh?
Oh, okay, let me also add here. Now, I think it's a simple fact, the size of India. And until Afghanistan became a member of South Asian Regional Cooperation, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, none of the South Asian countries shared borders with each other than sharing borders with India. So the very size of India, physically, the size of India in terms of its demographic, the size of India in terms of its economic power, would make China much more conscious of how to engage with South Asia. So India would then become a leading factor, both in terms of India becoming the source of China to engage South Asia, or India becoming a country to be avoided in engaging South Asia. So when in first 4 decades China was engaging South Asia other than India, it was still driven by India consciousness. Just as now China is engaging South Asia through India by majorly engaging India and others along with, it's again India-centric. Now the reverse argument is whether India has played a leading role in taking South Asia in engaging China. You see, from late 1980s, there was a famous Chinese foreign minister, Chen Shih-chen, and my very dear colleague, Mr. Dungana will vouch me. In 1989, Chen Shih-chen visited Kathmandu and made a very significant speech and a comment, which was followed and became a regular refrain of Chinese leaders in the entire 1990s. Now, what Chen Shih-chen had said in Kathmandu at that time was to say that the bilateral disputes of South Asian countries with India are bilateral and China has nothing to do with it. So, entire 1990s saw that China decided to step back and say countries of South Asia should engage India on their own and not look for China's help in engaging India, which is very different compared to how Chinese foreign policy during Cultural Revolution was running. Very, very radical policy. So yes, both China considers India as a leading player in engaging South Asia. And therefore, India also considers itself as a leading player in taking South Asia together in engaging China. So in 2005, for instance, it was clearly India's willingness that made it possible finally to bring in China as an observer into South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. So India has also played a role in ensuring that collectively we, the South Asian nations, engage China in a far more productive fashion in building developmental partnerships. Irrespective of hiccups that keep happening, I always underline that all nations do have irritants, even in the best of relationships. I mean, if you think India-United States relationship is really moving very, very fantastic, you can always find hiccups even in that relationship. Recently, the US naval ships had intruded into Lakshadweep waters in India without Indian permission, and that created certain irritations. So in any relationship, there are going to be irritants, but if the relationship is thick and strong, it can overcome and deal with those irritants very easily. And I think that is what is significant in looking at China, South Asia, that they do have irritants, but they also have capacity to overcome them, address them. And therefore, Galwan incident last year to me was more or less like an aberration, which was a mistake or slip that happened, despite all the control and restraint that both Indian and Chinese forces have shown all these years. So let me end this answer by simply saying yes, China today recognizes India as a leading player in engaging South Asia, and so also India sees its role in engaging entire South Asia together while engaging with China.
Okay. And then we have a question here for both speakers. What is the South Asian perspective regarding India's role in the Quad? And is the Quad getting any support from the South Asian countries?
So, if I may briefly explain this particular issue, is that recently China has released a statement towards Bangladesh in terms of its reluctance for it to join such arrangements such as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And Bangladesh gave a significant reply, which was that it is up to Bangladesh to develop and craft its own foreign policy and strategic policy. So as we can see, there may be, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, as I have tried to project from time to time, should and is trying to go beyond just military dimensions. It may be able to encompass economic dimensions, which would be beneficial for the smaller countries in South Asia. And this in itself is a significant factor in solidifying South Asian countries' relations with Quad countries. You can see India and Japan and Australia and the United States either in bilateral or trilateral engagements trying to enhance economic security and political, social, cultural aspects of that relationship. So again, it is a matter of geopolitics that may cause disruptions from this particular issue. And this may continue to go on until there is that level of strategic competition between India and China as well.
Okay, thank you, Don. Professor Singh?
Let me be quick and short on this, since Mr. Gill has already answered this question. Quad itself is a work in progress. We are talking of Quad Plus already, which would include South Korea, New Zealand, Vietnam. We are talking of Quad Plus Plus now because so many countries, Germany, France, UK, have issued their integrated reviews and Indo-Pacific strategies of showing enormous interest. Canada, in fact, European Union recently issued. ASEAN has issued in the Pacific outlook. The United States, of course, was the first in 2017. Brazil, Chile, so many countries are showing interest now in engaging in the Pacific. So not only we are talking of Quad Plus, but Quad Plus Plus. So Quad is a work in progress, which means it may not stay Quad of 4 nations. It could potentially engage other nations as well. And I'm sure South Asia will have also aspirant nations to join it, just like Southeast Asia has aspirant nations who want to join Quad. Quad has also expanded thematically. For example, Quad is now talking about things like trilateral resilience initiative triggered by Japan. It is talking about naval diplomacy, for example, of holding Malabar naval exercises. It's talking of diplomatic engagements. They had the first leader summit meeting in middle of March, 16th March, where they created 3 working groups on very interesting issues: critical technologies, climate change, and pandemic. So you see the thematic remit is also expanding. So I often say Quad is expanding vertically, horizontally, thematically. So it's a work in progress, and therefore it does create space for other South Asian nations to also join in potentially. And we might see some other countries from South Asia joining it. But right now it looks like the four major nations are part of it. And therefore India joining the Quad is a recognition of India being an integral part of the Indo-Pacific narrative. And that comes again as a certain amount of recognition of India's role in the larger emerging theater of the Indo-Pacific, where India has constantly tried to balance between engaging the US-led initiatives, but also at the same time underlining that India would like to see Russia and China, who are significant powers in the Asia-Pacific region, the Pacific region, should also become part of that discourse. And Quad could potentially even think of engaging these nations. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Singh. I believe Dr. Clemente was raising her hand. Ma'am Tina, are you there?
Minute. Okay. Yeah, I have two questions for Professor Singh. So first, what do you think are the underexplored potential game changers in India-China relations in the next 5 years? So that's the first question. My second question is, how is India's engagement with the Blue Economy framework, where maritime development interfaces with security and ocean governance, give insight into its concerns toward China's own engagement with it? Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Nice to see you, and thank you for hosting me today. Let me try to answer your two questions. Second question, first on Blue Economy. You would remember in March of 2015, Indian Prime Minister was visiting three neighboring countries, Seychelles, Mauritius, and Sri Lanka, and had announced something which is today called SAGAR, SAGAR, which means security and growth for all in the region, which showcased India's maritime focus in extended neighborhood of building partnerships in the maritime domain, in which Blue Economy is part of it. And the most recent initiative India has on the subject is called Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which again talks about 7 specific sectors, in which Blue Economy is again one, where we need to work together as partners and develop that relationship. At home also, India has a similar initiative called Sagar Mala, which is meant to really work on all the ports that India has. If you see Indian subcontinent jets into Indian Ocean with a large coastline with very, very important ports. And even in that domestic initiative, Sri Lanka has shown interest to partner with us. And India, of course, as you know, is the largest user of the Colombo. South Asia's largest port is Colombo, and the country that receives largest amounts of material using the Colombo port is India. So India, Sri Lanka already have a strong relationship in maritime domain in that sense. So that to me appears that India has really focused on Blue Economy increasingly, and not just unilaterally, but also building partnerships with both immediate neighbors and extended neighbors, and combining that exploration with the larger maritime domain of Indo-Pacific region. Now, when we move to Indo-Pacific is where India and China become really, really significant players, despite their irritants at the bilateral level. So many people perhaps do not focus very often that we keep talking about enormous contestations, concerns that India has with the rising naval presence of China in the Indian Ocean. And Mr. Gill so beautifully brought out the details of how China's naval presence in the Indian Ocean has increased. And we keep talking about the string of pearls. We keep talking about Djibouti being the new base that China has built. But in the same region, from 2008 India and China have also encouraged their navies to do joint patrolling in dealing with piracy problems. In fact, there is a specific case of January 2017 when Chinese and Indian navies together rescued a ship that was hijacked by pirates in Gulf of Aden. So there are always instances which showcase that there is not only contestation but also cooperation. And in large countries of size of India and China, there will always be, like in United States and China, there are contestations and cooperation also. So we have to really take a balanced view of what exists between the two nations. Now, very quickly, the last point you made in the next 5 years. What are areas of significant areas that need focus of cooperation? I have already underlined the healthcare sector where India and China are major players. You know, all the patents and R&D may be in developed nations, but much of the production of equipment, of medicines, of vaccines happens in China and India. So they really have to coordinate on how to maximize that advantage of being the largest producers of both health workforce, health equipment, health medicines, health vaccines. So that coordination will see some kind of, I think, greater focus. Now, whether we will achieve greater coordination, I don't know. But focus on that coordination will definitely increase. And also people-to-people relationship, because largest societies are now able to connect with each other without any controls. You know, virtual world allows Indian and Chinese people to connect all the time. And you heard last year, in middle of the tensions, India had blocked about 200 Chinese applications on social media in India. That means how many platforms we share with each other. You understand that? So in that sense, people-to-people connection is going to be enormously significant in next 5 years. But also significant in next 5 years, I think, is this enormous sense of their inordinate regional and global role, which will tell them that they should not focus too much on historical bilateral irritants, try to resolve and manage them better so that their larger historic role that they have, the opportunity that they have to play the role together at regional and global level, is not going to continue forever. There's a window for opportunity here, where China and India can step in and take that space of playing the leading role in how the post-pandemic world order is organized. And I think next 5 years would see the greater focus on that coordination and how that can be possible. Again, I'm not sure how much we will achieve in that direction, but I'm saying the focus of where the coordination need to expand, we see these areas emerging important. I may have missed one or two other areas, and Tina Clemente herself is a great expert in the area, so I'm sure she will have some more ideas, which either she can share now or later. But definitely, despite all the talk about contestations, cooperation remains an integral part of how China and India engage with each other and will engage with each other. And that will also influence how China engages South Asia. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Singh. So in the interest of time, maybe we will just have one last question. Okay, we have here: how has India responded to China's increasing presence in South Asia, in particular within the context of the Belt and Road Initiative? Has it, by any chance, enacted any similar connectivity or infrastructure initiatives on its own? So for both of our speakers.
Dr.
Jill,
Singh,
would you like to go first?
you may go first, Dr. Singh. It'll be an honor.
Okay, thank you. So let me say Belt and Road Initiative is an extremely ambitious and unusual vision or project that China has presented. And it has its enormous lure, because most of South Asian countries, including India, remain infrastructure deficit countries. And if there is a country that offers to build infrastructure on almost turnkey projects, there is an enormous attraction that BRI has had in South Asia. And we have seen repeatedly one after another countries accepting that, including Nepal, for example. And that has impacted India's consciousness of how China is becoming much more influential in India's immediate neighborhood in South Asia. But having said that, I think it's also significant to understand limitations of Belt and Road Initiative and how increasingly all the South Asian nations have become increasingly aware of those limitations of Belt and Road Initiative. One good reflection of that understanding of limitations among South Asian countries on BRI can be seen in how every time there is a regime change in any South Asian country, indeed also in Southeast Asia, you saw what happened when Malaysia had a change of leadership. Anytime the regime change happens, the new leaders come in South Asian countries, the first thing they do is question Belt and Road Initiative partnerships. Very often they say we will investigate it and they talk about opaqueness in contracts. They talk about all the mischiefs in the contracts. And then of course China engages the new regime as well with whatever way they have. And we all understand how Chinese have very special ways of engaging leaders. Those leaders also over a period of time become fine with those BRI projects. So there is a certain understanding of discomfort with Belt and Road Initiative that is showcased every time the new leader comes. That is also showcased sometimes in the protests that leaders face on the ground. So for instance, in Sri Lanka, there were enormous protests against how Hambantota was not liked by civil society. And there were questions raised on the Hambantota project and how Chinese not only built it, but also had 99 years of lease. Pakistan's Gwadar port again, Singapore company could not run it again, 43 years of lease Chinese had taken. So ground level also there are discomforts, and to some extent it's not only India that is talking about Belt and Road Initiative creating debt traps, but now many South Asian countries also are talking about these Belt and Road Initiatives being not commercially viable and therefore creating debt traps. So we are very fantastic, very attractive, but it's also lately showcasing limitations. Third and final point is how Belt and Road Initiative is also not driven by creating public goods, as China would like to share with the world. China would like to project its desire to build public goods. It is driven instead by Chinese compulsions of having enormous excess of finance. At one point in time, they had $4.5 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. And any money lying in the bank just like that becomes junk and you have to invest it. So under compulsion, they have to go and invest even in conflict zones where per dollar returns can be very questionable. But they have to invest out of compulsions. They have compulsion of excess production. Factories are churning out materials and they need to go and deliver it somewhere. Second compulsion. Third compulsion, about 3 million students come out of universities in China every year, and they need employment. So by the last count, 1.3 million Chinese are working in Africa. So this fantastic program of Belt and Road Initiative is driven by compulsions. And therefore, it is unstoppable, even if it is loss-making. So the good thing for South Asians and others is that this will continue despite making losses, because it is driven by compulsions. And therefore, India has, last point on your question for me to answer, has understood this game. And therefore, last 6, 7, 8 years, you will notice India has stopped competing with Belt and Road Initiative. India is not only not participating with BRI in South Asia, India is also not competing with Belt and Road Initiative in South Asia. Of course, we have our infrastructure investment programs with South Asia, which are both preceding and following Belt and Road Initiative, but they're not built to compete with China. Much greater focus now the foreign policy has on South Asia is on showcasing ethnic, civilizational, cultural, religious, people-to-people, linguistic relationship, inter-societal relationship that India shares with South Asia. And since Mr. Dungana is still on my screen, he will vouch when Indian Prime Minister goes to Nepal, which are the cities he's visiting, which are the sites he's visiting. He's visiting religious centers, cultural centers. So India is showcasing how India's relation with South Asia are very distinct. They are not limited to commercial profit-making drives. Chinese relationships are driven by commerce and strategic partnership. India's relations with South Asia are far deeper, far widespread, and that is being underlined by India's foreign policy increasingly, so that we can showcase how BRI is not something that should really disturb India's relationships in South Asia. And we have seen the positive impact of that very clearly, how South Asian nations are increasingly engaging with India separately, differently, and how they are engaging with China separately and differently. And very often there are issues again which become irritants, but they are irritants which are perfectly manageable in these relationships.
And if I just may add just two brief points in line with this. The first point would be complementing the point of Dr. Singh regarding the limitations. Just last year, China has announced at least 20% of the BRI has been significantly affected because of the pandemic, and that countries in South Asia and the greater Indian Ocean region have been starting to push back certain investments or shelving them or downscaling them, even in countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, for example, Bangladesh, because of certain aspects such as the transparency issues, such as the cost and the feasibility. Now, that's as far as limitations would be concerned. The future trajectory of the BRI, I agree completely with Dr. Singh that it would continue. And India banks on a different approach, a different regional approach in terms of solidifying its position in South Asia. Though India has tried to incorporate such an arrangement, such as the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, for example, but did not really gain significant momentum. India is also establishing infrastructural developments in neighboring countries, in Nepal, in Bhutan, in Myanmar as well, in Bangladesh. So this may be a significant point for reflection regarding where this goes from here. Thank you.
There. Okay. So thank you to both our speakers. So of course, I think there are still a number of questions, but unfortunately, we are of course pressed for time, and we have actually ran out of time already. So with that, of course, I would like to thank our two speakers who have very generously shared their thoughts and their ideas and their own perspectives regarding our discussion on the relationship of China with South Asia. Okay, and of course, aside from our speakers, our multiple participants over here who have joined us for today's discussion. Okay, so before we end, with the request of Professor Singh, if we could all turn on our cameras, and I will be taking a group picture of our session today. Okay, so to everyone who is willing to open their cameras. Okay, people are still opening them, and of course, I almost forgot that I would like to recognize the presence of the Philippine ambassador to China. Sir Chito Santa Romana is here with us today. Okay. Okay, so we have our cameras on. Okay, so with that, please share your smiles in 3, 2, 1. Okay. So we have our pictures already. We'll be uploading it to the PAX Facebook page as soon as we can. Okay. So with that, we went a bit over time, but nonetheless, I hope that everyone picked up a thing or two and learned a lot from our two key resource persons today. And so again, thank you to Professor Singh and of course Don for joining us. And of course, to everyone here in Manila, it's already lunchtime. And so I wish everyone a very eventful day and a happy day. And of course, and a very good lunch for everyone. Okay, so that, thank you again. And PAX does have a number of other events, and we hope to see you in our future events. Okay, we will be sending a post-event evaluation form, and if you wish to have a certificate, of course, please accomplish it. Okay, so that's all. Thank you.
Thank you.